we'll go sit in on somebody else's.
So it's an hour as well, which is the other point. Do you need any prompting in terms of time? I've usually found in the hour-long sessions it's usually pretty straightforward.
Yeah, I don't think so. And I don't even know if we'll need the. I mean, it's hard to know with the like more of a discussion session whether it depends how talkative everyone is. So.
Sure. Oh, that's interesting.
I think BAP teachers are talkative. That's one thing I decided during the conference. I mean, often you get in these kind of discussions, there's so much noise, from all the discussion, all the energy.
Isn't that interesting that it's like through that they're now characteristically
and that's one thing I've
English
this particular conference.
Okay. Well,
but people are not afraid to talk and express their opinions and ask questions.
I hope that stays true.
Apart from me,
this one.
And his surname is Andrew Morris, and because he wanted to be nice to me, he put my name first.
Let's see. Clicker working. Yep.
So it was Margaret Morris.
Let's use my laptop for notes, I guess.
Sorry, it was just he's just trying to be nice.
You're going to group people. I mean, do you want people to talk in groups? How's it going to work? The discussion.
It's sort of. I have the questions on. I'll show up, and I was thinking it depends how many participants there are.
So
If it's
Pittsburgh,
big, we might just. I'll do groups, and if it's smallish, I'll just do it.
Okay, so it could run through
have
there.
a great
Right, and it could be smallish, but people might be just.
Yeah, that's true.
Top.
I mean, I think
I think if it's like 10 or less, we'll just do it all as one big group, and otherwise.
pick the elder, pick the younger.
Probably, I'm not.
We've got the British Prime Ministers.
So yeah, I've honestly never made the association to armpits with Pittsburgh. So.
Oh no, neither have I.
Now, it wasn't the pit, you know.
Oh, that also
it's the pits, you know that expression.
Yeah,
oh,
like
God,
it's the worst.
Yeah, I mean, I get that. There must be some kind of mental association there, or we can move very quickly from
I'm trying not
Pittsburgh
to.
to armpits.
Yeah, I'm not trying to get out of that. I'm sorry, but I think most people make that. It's the connotation, isn't it?
Well, I think I've been exposed to people being way more explicit and replacing the P with an SH when they talk pejoratively about
I used to live in Latina in Italy, and they used to call it latrina. Okay, so
oh, that's clever.
yeah. Well, thank you.
Yeah, and I'm sure we'll be discussing the reading.
And, this is not very disabled. I mean, I'm not really disabled, but I do tend to fall over a lot. And I have fallen over in lots of bits. This is I just think I'm not even going to go there.
No, please take the front row.
Sorry.
I like having people in the front, so that's amazing. Oh, yeah. All right. Well, it looks like it's 12:23 by mine, so let's get started. Thank you for coming. And rather than being as this is the maximum spread for this room, I'd like the exact opposite if that's possible. So if you're comfortable being closer to other people, if you could maybe, it's okay if we come closer to this row, we'll make it a smaller room.
This is what my students do. We had one of those desks that they move. And they're all sitting at the back, and I'm just thinking, can you make my life easier?
Yes, so as teachers you can all empathize with this particular issue. Yes, and look at these lovely little enclaves.
This is what my inbox looks like.
Oh, it gives me panic attacks. Ramsey's inbox.
I'm going to be emailing out the paper if anybody needs it.
Perfect. Well, thank you very much. Okay, so this session is a little bit different, so I tried to put it in the titles just so that there wouldn't be any horrible shocks, but it is a reading group session, and I was really excited when I saw this on the potential formats for our talk, so I selected it, and I think it's great that BALEAP is doing it, and yeah, this is my first reading group at a conference. Let's see how it goes. Has anyone here been to any other reading group sessions so far? All right, we'll all be in this together. This is
You'll be the best one.
the experiment. Yes, this will be the best one you've been to all conference. Okay, great. So it is a reading group, and this is sort of the topic is using corpus linguistics to understand the academic domain. It's a bit of an excuse. selfishly, I want to hear everyone's opinion so that we can take that information and help to inform what I work on, which is the Duolingo English test. So we're always trying to better understand the academic domain and the construct, and try to use that information to make our test as authentic and comprehensive as possible. And hopefully you get a lot out of this as well. So let's dive in. Oh, do we not have? Oh, there we are. Two pretty faces out there. Yes. So was anyone at Ramsey's talk earlier this morning? Oh, a couple of people. Great. So this is a natural segue on. Ramsey and I are both assessment scientists at DEP, specifically working on validity and research and outreach. All right, so just in case you haven't read the article, and I'm not going to ask for a show of hands, I thought we'd do a little paper summary. So I'll do a little mini lecture at the beginning just about the paper to give everyone an idea. And that way that should help with some of the questions that are coming up afterwards. Don't worry, the questions, a lot of them can be answered as well, even if you haven't read thoroughly the paper in question. With that said, Ramsey's here to help, so if you don't have the paper but would like the PDF, it is behind a paywall, please email Ramsey and he will respond with the attachment. So his email address is Ramsey, R-A-M-S-E-Y, at duolingo.com. So yeah, if you would like the article, email him. All right, so we'll do a little summary, then we'll look at some questions sort of about the methods, and then spend the majority of the time, hopefully, on implications. So what does this mean for the EAP classroom and EAP tests, and EAP curricula, and all things EAP. We have an hour. This sort of depends, as with any discussion, it is how much we have to say. So take the full 60 minutes, and if it doesn't, that's also fine as well. All right. All right, before I jump into this, any questions about what we're doing here, the format?
I just wanted to ask if it's okay to take photos of the slides.
Sure. You're also welcome to email. Ramsey can send you the entire slide deck as well if that's easier. Yeah. Perfect. Okay, so this paper by Kyle et al. So Kyle is a corpus linguist who usually works on lexical sophistication and grammar indices as well, and some of his colleagues. They're really interested in, well, how have things changed in the current university settings compared to in the early 2000s. So we have a lot of corpus data from over 20 years ago at this point, and it's super useful data, but it's a bit out of date at this point. So this is sort of the basis for this investigation. And so Kyle and his colleagues asked, well, how similar or how different are the features of both spoken and written language in university environments within and across different registers, specifically comparing the more traditional non-technologically mediated learning environments. So this is like face-to-face classroom environments compared to what he calls technology-mediated environments. So this is things like during Zoom lectures or on course management systems, anything that's mediated by some form of technology, both either in speech or in writing. So a pretty sort of broad question. And so he tackles it from a corpus linguistics perspective. And so the way he uses corpora is to identify all these different linguistic features that are specific in a specific domain. So looking at these big bodies of text, well, what does the vocabulary look like? What grammatical patterns are being used in different ways? And this is based on the idea that, well, register affects the distribution of linguistic features. So there's lots of things that make one genre or register different from another, but these are often reflected in sort of concrete linguistic features. So he's not really looking at like the roles of different participants or geographic context, things like that, but specifically language features as they differ across registers. Totally acknowledging that there's lots of other things that make genre is different. And so the person he worked with and the university he comes from is Biber, is sort of the big name here, has done lots of corpus linguistics work. And in 2004, Biber came out with a corpus that's been very influential, called, well, TK2 Swal. It's sort of a horrible corpus name. He wasn't very good at naming corpora, but he's good at compiling them. And what they found is that, probably not surprisingly, that university writing has linguistic features that increase informational density. So there's lots of, for example, complex noun phrases and clauses. There's higher degrees of abstract nouns and just lexical words per utterance as well. And in contrast, university speaking has more interactional language features. So different types of discourse markers, more use of second person pronouns, shorter turns. So all the differences that you would expect to see between speech and between writing. What he also found, though, is that some of these features actually can vary across modalities. So sometimes one form of speech and one form of writing is actually pretty similar compared to one form of speech and another form of speech. So for example, syllabi and service encounters actually share a lot of similarities in that both of them have sort of short, not always complete grammatical utterances, whereas like a syllabi in a textbook, even though they're both writing, are actually very different in terms of their linguistic features, like the length of the clauses or the type of lexis being used. So just because something's speech and something is writing doesn't mean that they're always going to be similar linguistically. All right, and so for me and for Ramsey, this sort of matters in terms of assessment, and it can really support the validity of proficiency assessment. So we want to make sure that we are actually assessing the authentic language as it's actually occurring in contexts like university settings. So that's sort of the domain description inference, it's sometimes called. And also, based on that, we want to make sure that what we're testing is actually representative of the skills that learners and test takers are going to be using in academic situations. So that's, can we extrapolate? Can we take these test scores and do they actually mean something in the academic context? All right, so yes, we believe that corpora can provide some of this information, but only if they're representative. So if the corpus is compiled from irrelevant sources, well then the frequencies in that corpus aren't really going to be very helpful. So with that in mind, we're going to look at a couple of these corpora. All right, so this is the abbreviation that comes up 100 times in the paper if you've seen it, which is TMLE, Technology Mediated Learning Environments. So this isn't anything new, but it really accelerated by the pandemic. So the proliferation of online courses, course management systems. And so Kyle here, yes, is trying to identify differences between other more traditional forms of writing and speaking and these TMLEs. And he first did this corpus in 2021, in the original one. And what he found is that in these technology-mediated environments, the spoken input was actually more challenging than in traditional environments. But in contrast, writing is less so. And so what we see is that in traditional contexts, there's a real divide between the features in the speech and the features in the writing. But then in these technology media environments, so those differences become a bit smaller. So the speech is sometimes getting more challenging linguistically, and the writing is getting less, and it's sort of less of such a clear divide between what is speech and what is writing. But with that said, the paper we're looking at now is trying to dig a little deeper and say, okay, well, those are sort of like general trends, but actually, what are the differences between those registers? So what makes one register more complex than the other? All right, so just a quick look at the methods. So he was comparing these two corpora. So TK2 Swal was the early one, so that's 2.8 million words. Important caveat here that this is all data from the US context, so this raises questions about how generalizable is that. In our survey that we showed a little earlier today, there was actually a lot of consistency between what people were saying were the needs in the US and the UK, but I'd be interested to hear what you have to say about these results in terms of generalizability, so that's always something important. And then in the new corpus, it's a bit bigger, so that's 4.5 million words. Again, in the same context, US universities, this time between 2018 and 2020, so just pre-pandemic and then stretching into just the early stages of the pandemic as well. Okay, so we collected these big bodies of text, these millions and millions of words, and then we ran what's called MDA, multi-dimensional analysis, to look at all the linguistic features. And Kyle has created a set of tools which are freely accessible and really excellent. This one, TASK, again, not a great acronym, TAASSC, analyzes lexical grammatical features. There's also another tool in that same kit called TAILS, which is for Lexis. There's one for assessing the reading ability level of different texts. So there's a whole suite of NLP tools that basically you input a text and it spits out lots and lots of different metrics. Yeah, and you can download the program, or you can, there's like a Python, you can use the code as well. All right, and having collected all these different linguistic features, lots and lots of different numbers about aspects of lexis and grammar, he then used exploratory factor analysis to try to cluster some of them together, to group them together. So how do these linguistic features cluster in different ways across the different registers? All right, so what did he find? So these dimensions, so these are sort of the clusterings. He actually came up with 6 different dimensions, but only 3 of them were significant. So I'll just look at the significant ones here. So the first one is some of the features, when you sort of, these labels he's named himself, but he found, okay, one of these dimensions, it seemed like, is oral versus literate discourse. So this is more like speech versus writing. So in this dimension, all the speech things tended to cluster together and all the writing registers tended to cluster together. And what you saw is that in the TMLEs, that the speech was more writing-like than previously, and vice versa, that the writing was more speech-like. So this, again, speaking to this aspect, that it seems like the very clear distinctions between what is speech and what is writing, linguistically, seems that there's some sort of merge going on and they're becoming more similar to each other. He also found that out of all the different registers, the different text types, that the syllabi and slides were the least speech-like of the registers, which makes sense. They're not complete utterances, especially on slides. These little bullet points is not very much how people speak. The second dimension, so this was more about linguistic complexity, so both lexical, so the sophistication of vocabulary, both single and multi-words, and also phrasal complexity, is that it really sort of varied across some of the different registers. So instructional videos were the least complex, compared to instructional readings were more complex than all the other written registers. Again, I don't think there's anything particularly surprising about that the readings teachers were giving out contained more sophisticated language. And finally, the last significant one here was dimension 3, which is procedural discourse. So this is things like giving instructions, or service encounters where you have to explain the steps of something. And the way we saw is that there was more of this dimension in speech than in writing. I think that's pretty common. You can have instructions in writing, but it tended to be more in speech. And that announcements and discussions scored the highest on this dimension, whereas presentation slides scored the lowest. And then these other dimensions, if you're very interested, we can talk about them, but I did find other dimensions that didn't vary significantly either across the corpora or across the registers. All right, so that's sort of the whirlwind super fast summary of this long academic paper. Does anyone have any clarification questions? We can look back at any of the slides about what they were trying to do with the study. Yes?
When guessing Biber took masses of academic texts and analysed them. In an online environment, what is the university?
Christopher Kyle.
Kyle, what's he doing that's, in terms of academic text online, what's the uniqueness of the online texts that are being looked at? Do you see what I mean? If you've got a body of academic writing,
Yeah.
which Biber is looking at, how is it different in an online environment?
Sure. Biber actually looked at a number of different text types, not just these instructional readings, but instructional readings, I agree, out of all the different text types, there's the least clear distinction between what would make it in a mediated learning environment and what would be in a classical environment. So in this case, it was just, for example, whether it was given out in class, so basically hard copies, or whether they were sending like PDFs that they were expected to, that they were probably reading on their computers at home, and so there was no print copy of it. But if you look in the paper, Table 2 has a list of all the specific text types that are included in each of the corpora. Let me just take a quick look at Table 2 and see if it provides any other detail. Yeah, so the collection context for the instructional reading was through a MOOC, through the massive online. What does MOOC stand for now?
Massive open online course.
Open online course. Yeah. Okay. Any other questions? Great. In that case, the talking for me is, as the primary talker is over, and teacher, let's turn it over to some questions for everybody. So these are, I thought we'd do, sort of break it up in the same way that the paper is broken up. So maybe some methods ones to start with before we open up to the bigger, broader picture. So there's a couple of questions here. And I can put on the screen as well, again, this Table 2, or if you have a copy, you can look at it. But is this mediated corpus actually representative of the target language use domain of the EAP context that you're working in your context? And would you have included any other text types? So I'll put up on the screen the entire list. Yeah, so why don't we start with number 1, and that way I can actually show on the screen. Is it okay if I plug the HDMI into my personal computer?
That should be fine.
Okay, perfect. And
Last words.
what's that?
Famous last words.
Yeah, so we'll see. And if it's okay, yes, could we do, how many people do we have? 6 plus. Ramsey, do you want to join this group over here? And we can have the 4 on this side, and the 3 over here. You can have a stool if you want, Ramsey. You can squeeze in. Perfect. All right. Oh, great. You've got it on your laptop. Well, in that case, maybe I'll just give my laptop over to this other group. In that case, maybe I'll just give you mine so that's okay.
Technology mediated learning.
No, no, no.
So this is a list of everything
TLU.
included in
Target language use.
Okay.
Yeah.
their corpus. Yes, I've just provided the list.
And net resolutions as well. Maybe they're in 2 pounds.
Yeah. I think I saw a presentation by Christopher Kyle at the conference, and where he talked about
We sat
sort of
at a
the
table,
background
little
of
coffee
how
break,
he was talking
and we
about the
sat at a
challenges
table
of
with
seeing
somebody
people
else.
provide to I think the Public University
Yeah,
data
so
is
you
coming from
co-authored with
the online courses or hybrid courses and then the platforms piece.
So
That was very
just
challenging to get people to hand over the data, so they turn to MOOCs for various
neither nice nor neutral, I think.
To represent
I don't know why I was
really
when we sat
authentically
together,
the academic
but
context that
I
you
just
work in.
recollect that
Is this a
we
good
sat
list?
together.
Is there anything else that you
I was mainly listening to the conversation.
No.
And would it have been
Because just this
yes
year,
pronunciation?
I
Was that
asked
the book?
Yeah, it was.
all of
Yeah.
them to
So
teach
that
my
was-
master's student
And then
doing
So I'm going back to
I was there
that
thinking
question.
pharmacy
So
and some other, I
yeah, I
don't
was just
remember
finishing
all of
my
those
master's
programs.
degree and thinking
So
about
there was no
employment.
material,
And the
and
discussion
the the reason they gave it to me was that they thought I could easily produce a material that
a job
would be
had come up
authentic.
probably in the
And
UK, and
actually,
there was
I
some
think I
discussion about
asked the
whether
students
or
to
not
give me
you should apply for this job.
highlight some of the
And you said
articles.
you
And then
didn't intend to.
I used those articles, they were basically psychology.
Does that do you think that's all an instructional bit?
Around students
Really,
and
it wasn't, but
psychology articles didn't
I
always
wasn't really
found
introduced or anything, but I
psychology
just remember being
students. So
excited
we looked
about
at
it.
the course that I made
It might be
So I did go to
abstract skills.
and then we looked at the language
It's really useful.
concept, how the students were treated and the dress described. So that was very interesting.
So this,
yes,
I think that for me that would sort of fall under the instructional reading.
instructional reading.
Yeah, I mean, I was really or I had been very big on those.
That was one of the biggest
in fact, absolutely. So I was
updated
for
layout
years
things like
with
quizzes,
students.
Yes.
syllabi, so
It taught me a lot,
things
and it
That
was useful for
instructional
students
reading,
as
how would
well.
I know which
I mean, we
themes
graduated
are
from
covered
it
in the instructional
eventually after
reading?
using it for a number of years.
There's nothing about pharmacy,
Sure, so they just sampled from a wide range, did some paper about humanities and STEM, so they tried to get not a specific courses, so they did try to.
Yeah, because when you do the analysis, then can you choose
So we
specifically certain
purchased a lot of the
types of
copies of the book and
articles,
actually
psychology, and analyze the article about psychology for
Yeah.
So this one I think is all together.
copies of the book and then just went back on
Those two are when access and you could
because we used it with the whole cohort, which was actually
I think when I was at Warwick University,
yeah,
they tried to go
we had about 200 students somewhere, and we got a lot of generic forms of reading.
which apparently are the same,
No.
but now they have different names, so that if they have a right presentation, they're like you read it and there was something else, even if it's the same. Yeah, it's basically dissertation with all these headings and something, it's not an essay. But because students and international students understand what an essay is, well,
Yeah, it's very
a piece of writing,
About
that's so all this it's weird, so that's why I'm selecting, and these articles are out of date, are they
small
just quite recent?
student
Or
worship.
the ones, yeah, how do I know when they're
Which is very
written,
different
because the style changes and
Yeah, I think after I'd worked
Okay,
with that
and so yeah, I
textbook,
think that's all good points
Actually,
about the
you
instructional reading. What about some
You
of
might
the
not be
other
thinking of questions. I mean, this isn't
so there's not just the stuff that they were
Yeah,
saying,
you need
so
some kind of
everything
into that.
involved in live information knowledge of British context could be
But
that.
I think understand that it's difficult to assign kind of a list of like recommendations
interested
books to
in the
consult.
language of the
It's very inconsistent. It's a great book for
Yeah, it's like
teaching.
you might find any of these books useful and like consult them.
He was a great
He's a
teacher.
great
My
He was a great
teacher.
speaker. I attended
is that that's
He is a
not
great,
like that. There's like
his talks
specific
twice.
I mean,
I
it
watched a
was
lot of his
approached
YouTube
for the
videos.
maybe that's part of the
He was
difference.
very, very good.
He's a very great teacher, like that.
One hour,
Plays
week.
fast and
Which
loose.
Say that is
the language
part of the
of
response to question one is that it's not
I mean,
taken into account.
he talked about
In the British context, there's
proprioception,
a
which I think is a concept that I've never really.
And so it's
I
much.
mean, we generally ignored it, but never, or never came to a full understanding of what he was saying he was doing and what proprioception was in terms of.
Any others that you would add to
I
that
worked with
list
that
in
book
a dream
quite a
course?
lot. We used to the students didn't use the book, but we used
Yeah,
to
yeah, the theory, yeah.
stuff from the book, and I used his methods as well. Like I would never pronounce anything for the students.
Well, there used to be a wonderful website called
all the academic content.
I might have looked at
Academics that we were saying. If I remember, they were saying that in this American context, students are given quite set readings, whereas British context is very common to just.
I used to do that thing where
I remember when I was first starting my undergraduate degree,
you pronounce it
right, each
because
course you've got
I get
3-page reading
students to
certificate.
pronounce it, and when someone gave me a good model or
It
the best
wasn't
model
until
I could
years
get
later
from a
that
particular
somebody
group of
said,
students, I would say to them,
"Wouldn't expect
pronounce it like
reading
that. but it did engage the
It's only years later when I
approach,
became
so
the AP
rather than
teacher,
just
started to learn
pronounce after me where it was like basically
Yeah.
parroting.
It's not.
Yeah.
Which is what I did in the first term.
So what do you teach now?
Well, see, I'm doing enough. I've made nothing of myself. I'm doing last night but I'm teaching the AP. I've been teaching the AP for the last 5 years. I worked in three colleges for 10 years. I worked in Manchester. Yeah. I did some pre-sessional work at university pre-sessional work, but then I came to Warwick Uni in 2016, so I've been here. This is my 7th year. But after graduating from Reading with a master's degree, this is my first position actually in a university. I was quite surprised that I could kind of break into university teaching. I just found myself in a field, and it was really in a field behind just outside of the whole kind of environment.
I think the level foundation EAP are outside the whole academic environment, but I think that's the. Can I put your email or whatever? I may.
Sure. You might contact me asking for royalties.
Jonathan, I found somebody that's read a book, which I must get back to Jonathan. He gave me his email. I wrote to him about it. Maybe he was going on holiday to Sicily. I do Corpus University stuff, because I think that actually was something to say.
Writing scripts and then reading them out, and then you have less sort of reformulation, hesitation. Yeah.
Also, I said to him today, I went to does it matter what you like doing? Thank you,
Very conscious of how difficult it is online, so when you write it, you make it simple.
And we don't all, we're not always very nice people. There's a lot of competition because there's very few jobs where I teach, also teach with the mathematics. I think they know I mean, we could charge £50 an hour for maths teaching. So it loses a slightly better. It sounds terrible. And it makes my attempt by my manager physics is a lovely course, which we don't generally get such lovely people. So Nigel stands out as being a really good person.
The thing about Nigel though is this guy, he's got two sides. He's got a
Yes.
side relaxed, friendly side.
Let's.
He's got this
I've heard both groups
strict school
talking about the
side
first
as
one.
well.
Okay.
So a little bit about. Yes, there is a variety of different text types here. Maybe there could have been more. This group interestingly mentioned about maybe more discipline-specific information. So where these, especially for the instructional readings, that is going to vary by discipline a lot. So that would come into play. So I think that's a great point. Yes, there could be more. This group was talking more about more of the student output. So having a greater amount of the analysis of the learner texts as well, so which is obviously a huge part of the domain. Okay, yes, should we have time for all these? Sure, why not? So maybe just as a full room here, let's do number 2 together. So for the UK audience members, do you think this corpus data from this context is generally generalizable from the US to the UK, or would it be drastically different in some way? Would this study need to be replicated with a UK corpus?
Well, I don't think it should be replicated because anyway students are looking for the information which is like global. It doesn't matter who the author is, and really they take what they want, whatever is available, whether the authors are American, Australian, British.
So you're talking about, I think, the instructional readings.
Yes.
Is that right? So just the corpus more generally, so it also includes what's happening in the classrooms and the different places that students are using the language. So they're using it peer-to-peer, they're using it in support services, they're using it in the local environment. Do you think that translates from context to context, or
More yes than no, I think.
more yes than no? Okay.
I'm more concerned about the shortcomings of the current corpus.
Yeah.
So generalisable across the UK, I think you need to. I think you need to go for more corporate data before you can then try and see whether it's generalisable across the UK. I'm
Sure.
concerned that this lack of student output in there, that's something that I think as AP tutors you want to be knowing about. You want to know what it is that they need in order to create, to write the stuff that they're required to write,
Yeah.
or speak the things that they're required. I mean, did you do presentations? Is presentations in there as a part of the list?
So.
Yeah, there are instructional videos and also slides, but I think those are all coming from the
Right.
professors,
So,
not
so
students.
yeah, and this may be what they're focusing on for the scope of this
Yeah.
corpus is rather than looking at the learner corpora, which is the student output. In this case, their research questions are more about how is the input that students receiving different, rather than like how is student output changed. But I think that's an equally, if not more important question, but maybe answered by learner corpora rather than this is more like an input corpus.
Question which might just show my ignorance, but does the corpus data need to be regional specific or global? So should you be having all English speaking academic language going in there so you've got a wider range, or are we sort of protecting the different academic styles from different regions by having regional corpus? I'm quite new to all of this, so I don't know what the ideas are to guide this.
I think that the general consensus is that there's pros and cons to both. So having a large representative reference corpus is incredibly useful because more people can access it and generalize and compare results. But the downside is that more local corpora are going to be more informative about specific contexts. So in this case, yeah, they're bearing in mind this is US, and I believe it's in northern Arizona, so sort of western US. So fairly specific, which is, yeah, sort of, I share the same concern, which is why I put this question here, which is this more local corpus? How generalizable is it to other contexts? And to your point, I think more data is always good. So at this point, 5 million words is not large by corpus standards. In the past, that would have been pretty large, but it's pretty small these days. And that's partly because it's hard to collect all these types of data, like from these TMLEs and yeah. So more data, yes, more words, please. We'll skip 3 there, and I guess this is a more general question for everyone in the audience, which is number 4. How do you feel about sort of describing contexts using lexicogrammatical features? So here we're not thinking about other aspects. We're just saying this is how the context is based on the way that vocabulary and grammar essentially appears in the input. Do you think that's a good proxy for describing a context, or are other factors more important?
I think it's good. Have you got an example? Could you just
Sure.
to hand?
Yeah, so in this case, they're talking about, for example, instructions via Zoom or an online one. So they're going to describe it in terms of how long the phrases are that the instructor is using, the frequencies of the vocabulary items, the length, the total length of the output. So these are some of the types of features they're looking at. But I know, for example, some of my sociolinguistic peers don't really care about those features and might want to focus more on, well, what are some of the Demographic areas, what is the socioeconomic status of the students, or what is some of the race or ethnicity demographics, or what is the power dynamic between the teacher and the students for describing these genres. So other less easily quantifiable aspects perhaps.
I guess it depends on what we're trying to do with the data. I mean, if we're trying to teach lexical grammar to students, then it would be appropriate to focus on them.
Yeah, I agree with you. All right, and this is just out of my own interest. Has anyone ever tried to use Task or any of these other tools to either analyze any of your own, the input that you are giving students? Have you ever used one of these tools in any sense? But
yeah. I've used AntCom.
Sure, great.
Yeah, and I've asked the students to use AntCom themselves to demonstrate. For instance, I would take abstracts from 20 articles focusing 10 on business students, 10 on psychology students, but the articles all are about psychology. So we looked at how students were portrayed in those articles, and there were some differences. I can't remember now, but I think in business students' articles they were more. The phrase business student was used more frequently than psychology student, for example, in those other articles, something like that. But yes, I demonstrated how they can search for the frequency and which vocabulary is good for them to use. And then we looked at scale sketch engine because you can see collocations. You take the information from AntCom, and then you can check that further in scale sketch engine or dictionaries, online dictionaries. Yeah. So and then students would take their texts, create their own corpora, and analyze. So well, they were asking me if that would then be plagiarism if they selected all those most frequently used words. Well, that's your subject vocabulary. Use it once, but not in the same context. Then look for the synonyms, search through the definitions in online dictionaries, so you'll find some other useful vocabulary within definitions and so on and so forth.
Sure, yeah, so
really good.
if you haven't seen it, Lawrence Anthony's AntConc software is free to use and excellent for concordancing and
And scale sketch engine.
and sketch engine.
How could you use it for spoken output, and how exactly might you use it to check your own spoken instructions? I'd be fascinated to know what I'm using.
Well,
Yeah.
what else you can do, I haven't used it as such, but what you can do is there is an app called Otter, and that can transcribe the text. So for instance, sometimes I can't remember now what purpose it was used. So you can go to YouTube, find useful presentations or speeches, and then record that using Otter.
How are you spelling that?
O-T- .ai.
I'm not sure if you can also have that app on your laptop, but I'm not sure if you can record laptop to laptop. I mean, it's using the same tool, so I can use my mobile and record that, so you get that text, and then that will be your spoken.
I was thinking if we got permission, if we could do this with our lecturers, because you mentioned earlier we have students who have problems with listening, so in discussions and in the lectures themselves. So if we could actually analyse the lecture output and identify where the issues are coming from, that would be really useful.
Yeah, that would be amazing small scale research as well. So and across lectures and across classes. So yeah, Otter.ai is a very good one. The other one for transcription, Whisper, is also excellent.
I should also mention that, I mean, you can transcribe anything in Microsoft Word
True.
now, and it's well,
It's very good.
Subscription. And it's very good as well, the
Yeah.
transcription.
Yeah. The Microsoft Word, I would say it's very good for the lecturers. It struggles a bit with student speech sometimes, whereas Whisper's a bit better at
This one,
student speech.
Microsoft, is is it Whisper or Whisperer?
Whisper, yeah.
Whisper?
Yeah.
So do they get the transcription as well as the audio that you can export?
I think it's just the transcription.
Because with Otter you get audio recording, you get transcription, and you can export them, and it's free of charge.
Yeah.
And many minutes as well.
Yeah, so if you input basically you input the transcription. So to do it with speech is just another step that you have to convert speech to transcription, and then you just upload it to something like Task as a text file, and you can, interesting, some of the features that really people use for grammatical complexity are like mean length of clause is a good one, or complex nouns per clause. So basically this dense informational features of how dense is your speech with these complex nominals is a good indicator.
Fed this back to academics. So it came up before that students are having these problems, and in most classes I've taught, even before the AP, it's the native speaker walking into the room who's causing the issue. So is there any sort of education of the native speakers towards what's going to cause problems? So
Yeah, sometimes it can be done through CPDs. Yeah.
I'm just wondering if there's been any analysis of the corpora, which has been already fed back.
I had an observation and I used for my students. I still grade, so this is sort of like therapy. I used one of them is native speaker. A lot of them are native speaker like. I didn't want to say, "Have you finished?" I thought, "Speak now." So I said, "How are you getting on in your endeavours?" And that got picked up in my observation as something that wasn't communicated. And I'm just thinking, I'm trying to teach some language here, and there's a sort of little, that Michelangelo spark type picture. We've got to make things a little difficult so that they can jump over it. And how big is that gap?
I was one picked up for using the phrase "keep banging on about" in observation.
Oh, great.
But I've noticed subsequently that it's frequently used in academic environments in all kinds of different situations, including by.
Did you write back to this person?
It was John Morley from the University of Manchester who was behind the Manchester
Did
University
you write
phrase.
back on your observation? Did you
I
write?
was just accepting of it at the time.
Right, no, I didn't write back. I just thought I'm not even going to engage with this meaningless chatter.
Sure. I mean, I think there's, like most arguments, there's two sides to these. So it's very context dependent. So how important is conveying your message compared to how important is a pedagogical moment of having optimal, like more challenge. Sometimes you want things to be as clear and concise as possible.
But I just thought, how you doing? I used to have a class in Italy. This sounds terrible, really. And I had a group of boys at the back, and they would always talk too much. So I didn't tell them what it meant. But when they were talking noise, and they pretended they could really understand it, I had to STFU. And they were absolutely silent, and they never understood what it meant. But they were really quiet. And I told the girls at the front what it meant. And I just think, if you're in a context, people will understand what you mean. It doesn't necessarily have to have those words, so they would understand, keep banging on about.
Yeah, sure. I mean, that's the point, that understand comprehension isn't just taken from the language, but there's all kinds of cues, and that students don't have to, they won't be understanding every single word as a lecturer is speaking, for example. They'll be picking up on some of what the lecturer's saying, understanding it, so they'll be focusing and then kind of drifting away and thinking about shopping and lunch and stuff like that, and then coming back again, and that goes on throughout a lecture. So I don't think we need to worry too much about exactly the kind of language that we use. And there's a related point that I think there's a lot of informal language used by lecturers in university lectures as well. It's not unusual. Just because we're in an academic environment doesn't mean we use all this stilted formal language all the time when we speak.
Quite right.
I was just going to answer your question briefly. It reminded me of something in a slightly different context, but I mean, I'm more familiar with context of like L1 English students interacting with L2 English instructors, and I saw this brilliant poster at a conference where they were reporting on an intervention where they gave training to the students, to the L1 students, to to help them better understand features of L2 English. And I think that that might have used, been based on some research that might have involved like English as a lingua franca type corpora. But it's like maybe not exactly what you're talking about, but similar in terms of like trying to also educate the native speakers to be more
I mean, we're doing
understanding.
that with teachers of global business, and the whole idea is stopping the L1 students from complaining about the L2 students and actually getting them to learn communication with the lingua franca.
Yeah.
But it would be really nice to have some.
To Ramsey's point, there is a lot of research to that effect in the translanguaging research field. It tends to be more qualitative than quantitative, but it does focus specifically like on accommodating is one of their big ones. So adjusting your language, regardless of your first language, to accommodate to the intended audience, so to ensure that communicative competence, that the message is conveyed. So that is a big field of inquiry, although, like I say, it's still mostly qualitative. Okay, we've got about 10 minutes left, I think, if my watch is right. So some of these, we've sort of touched on some of these already. But yeah, some more implication questions from the findings of the study. So I guess I'll open this first one up. Any of these results surprising, or the opposite? Do any of the results, looking at those different dimensions, sort of match how you feel about the current EAP context? So maybe starting with specifically this idea that maybe modern writing in technology environments is maybe becoming a bit more speech-like in terms of like clarity and lower complexity, or the opposite, that maybe spoken speech in technology-mediated environments is actually becoming more complex or more writing-like in many ways.
I was going to say, we've got this discussion, and I asked my colleagues, when you write feedback to your class, do you make it speech-like, or do you make it more written-like? Especially if you're feeding back on essays. How formal do you go, or how low do you go? I prefer to keep my comments fairly formal, because I think I want to somehow reflect what they're meant to be using, but I still want to make it accessible. That's it.
Although they should also be using informal language in appropriate informal contexts, I would assume.
They should. So what is the correct informal, formal? What is the sweet spot for our feedback language?
Yeah, good question. I don't have an answer to that. I don't know if anybody else does. So it sounds like maybe your colleagues are becoming more informal.
But also I think that's a great response to one of the earlier questions, what's missing from the corpus, and that's a form of written input that students are confronted with on a regular basis that wasn't examined in the study.
That's a good point. So collecting a mini subcorpus of student feedback from different lectures and seeing maybe the feedback is becoming more informal over the last 20 years.
Maybe also looking at key words from feedback. So in the first session this morning, trying to define criticality, and one of the key issues that comes up is that students are always being told to be more critical.
What does that
Well,
mean?
exactly, and there's no explanation being given to them what critical thinking is and critical writing. So if we could analyse feedback and sort of compare that to student knowledge, that would be useful.
I think feedback's a personal thing. It depends on the person that's giving the feedback. I mean, like for example, I'll always review my feedback and strip out any kind of emotional reaction that I've had to the student's work. But I've got colleagues who will happily write, I was so disappointed with your essay. And that kind of language comes through a lot of some people's feedback.
I think that would be something interesting to analyze as well. And you would see that in, for example, the use of evaluative adjectives as sort of a proxy for what you're describing. So I think there are usually sort of linguistic metrics that you can look at to try to tap into anything you're interested in, like the emotional response.
But I think every sort of training course and seminar that I've been to, there's always talk about this feedback sandwich. Like you start off with something gentle, and then you put the difficult stuff in the middle, and then
So
you finish off with something that's supportive of the student at the end.
So can I will shut up now.
if I don't, you can hit me, you're near enough. So I also teach maths, and I took 2 of the students in who had really bombed in the exam, and I just said to them, do you want, and they're actually English, they're L1 English speakers. I said, do you really want me to tell you? He said, oh no, just tell us, we know we've done bad. And I think, you know, at a certain age, I don't think we want that sandwich.
Well, I'm not saying I personally agree with
I
that.
know, but I'm just saying, I think
I think there is a difference between maths and other subjects, the sciences and maths. In terms of right and wrongness, it's much more clear cut, I think, in maths. I might be wrong on the sciences.
It's not John Wiggles, it's the guy that did sorry, I'm not shutting up, Cabin Space, and he does this impression of an English language teacher, and then he does a maths teacher, and then an English language teacher. Yeah, that's a really good answer. Say it again. And there's the maths teacher going, that's right, that's wrong, that's right, that's wrong. So I think, but some of our students on the foundation do both subjects, and therefore we need to coalesce our feedback more.
Right, but a personal narrative isn't right or wrong. I mean, yeah, so to your point, I think it also depends on the student output that's going to inform what type of feedback you can deliver. Although, yeah, the tone is certainly can be for any discipline. All right, so maybe we've got time for one more question. So I'm interested in number 6, since this is something that I can actually affect in my own research life. So next time I see Dr. Kyle at a conference, I can go up to him and say, yeah, your study I thought was really interesting, but in the future, how about you do this? So what further studies, and I think we had some really interesting ideas here about analyzing instructor input for complexity across instructors. What other linguistic or corpus studies do you think would actually, if you read it, would actually impact you into changing your practice in some way? What would you like to know about the language that students are receiving in the modern EAP context?
I hate to mention ChatGPT again, but I think it's very difficult to do this because ever since the beginning of the pandemic, things have changed and are changing so rapidly, and then AI is going to change things possibly fundamentally across the academy. It's very difficult to then start going, right, let's have a look at the language in this domain, when in a year's time the language in the domain might be completely different.
Yeah.
I think spoken English is something that's going to become increasingly part of assessment practices, so doing more in terms of what people are using in presentations, for example, or seminar kind of assessment types. I've done some work on analysing lectures, and I was inspired to think about the differences between academic lectures, and they're huge.
Yeah.
They're massive differences. So to try and pin it down to particular language features when there's all sorts of things going on in lectures. I was looking at a landscape architecture lecture, whereas actually the slides were more important than the spoken language, because the slides is all the visual.
Yeah.
So it was actually the visual aspects of this lecture that were the most important with the content. Whereas in EAP, we talk about getting the slides right and supporting the spoken word. It actually is the flip side of what I was finding. But that's a very small kind of more ethnographic study compared to the more massified corpora studies you're doing. But I would be interested in looking at lectures. I know that I think it's is it MICAS, the Michigan?
The My Case, yeah, from Michigan, yeah.
And there's also a British one, which I think is local, British it's BASE, B-A-S-C, which is spoken English course.
Oh, I don't know that one.
British Academic Spoken English.
Yes.
And BAWE, B-A-W-E.
Yeah, this one I know.
There's no agreement on how to pronounce that, but
Yeah.
for some people
Well,
it's,
that's my pronunciation.
for some people it's
Bo. That's
Bowie,
what I
as in
heard
David Bowie.
yesterday.
Yeah.
And then for other people it's bore.
How are you spelling that?
B-A-W-E.
Yeah, so these are all great corpora. I don't know the base one, but I do know Bowie, and My Case we use a lot in the US, but again, they're a little bit outdated and need updating, so I would love to see a post Chat GPT corpus in comparison to previous
So I
years.
would like to know